Hi, this is Matt with LSAT Cracked. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about how to dominate role questions, where they quote a certain part of the argument, pointing back to a certain part of the argument in the question stem, and then you're asked, what role did that play? Okay, so step one is always the same. Find the conclusion. If there are two conclusions, figure out which one's an intermediate or subsidiary conclusion and which one's the main conclusion. It's important to understand that because if you're asked about the subsidiary conclusion, you don't want to just scan for a conclusion in the answer choices. There may be two answer choices, one that talks about a main conclusion and one that talks about a subsidiary conclusion. To recap what an intermediate or subsidiary conclusion is, they mean the same thing. It's something that is a conclusion because it was supported by one or more premises, but it in turn also functions as a sort of premise, as sort of a dual personality or a dual identity. It is a conclusion, but it also functions as something that supports, therefore you can say it kind of acts as a premise supporting the main conclusion. All right? So now you've got two possible things that the thing could be quoting. The excerpt could be the main conclusion, it could be an intermediate conclusion, it could of course just be a premise. That's the correct answer a surprising amount of the time. It's simply something that supports either the intermediate conclusion or it's something that supports directly the main conclusion. What else might you see on a role question? Well, the most challenging type of role question for most of the students that I work with is one where there is a claim being made by some scientists or some group of people, and then there are critics that go against that claim, and then the author of the argument attacks the critics. It's actually not that difficult. You simply just need to remember that the author is not attacking the original claim. The author instead is attacking the critics, who are of course critical of the original claim. By the way, that doesn't mean the author is necessarily saying the original guy is right. He's just saying that the hater, the critic, is mistaken in at least some aspect of his or her criticism. If you can keep that straight in your head, you'll be able to dominate those questions. A few other things to keep in mind. You want to make sure that you're aware of a concession, something we covered earlier in the course. Not everything that the argument posits or puts forward as fact is necessarily helpful or supportive of the conclusion or the main conclusion. Sometimes you admit something that's actually not helpful for your argument simply because you know that you have to. The opposition is going to bring it up in some debate that you have coming up. So you admit a weakness in your argument, and nonetheless, or in spite of, you still argue for your conclusion. So the reason I'm emphasizing this is I don't want you to think, oh, I've identified the one or two conclusions. I can just assume everything else that's here that wasn't what someone else said, like some scientists. I can just assume all of those are premises. Not quite. The things that support your conclusions are premises. But if it's something that actually seems to be a concession, right, in spite of, and the other structural indicators we've talked about in a previous lesson, realize you don't want to use the term premise to describe that. Keep all of these things in mind and you're going to be doing excellent on role questions. The one thing to realize is if you're struggling on role questions, you're almost certainly also struggling on main conclusion questions. Focus on improving there first, then come back 10 to 20 problems later to role questions, and you will notice that you have significantly improved if you've improved the underlying skill of finding the main conclusion.